The thermometer outside read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside Lars Eriksson's cabin, nestled within its massive wooden barn, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees with only a modest fire burning in the hearth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1842 came to the Montana Territory with a brutality that old-timers would talk about for decades. By mid-January, the cold had already killed 3 men in the valley where Lars Eriksson had built his homestead. 2 froze in their cabins when their fires went out during multi-day blizzards. The third died, checking his trap lines, caught away from shelter when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours. The surviving settlers knew these deaths weren't unusual. Winter in the northern Rockies killed people with mechanical efficiency. What made that particular winter remarkable wasn't the cold itself, but what it revealed about how most people were surviving it wrong. Lars Eriksson sat in his cabin on the morning of January 18, 1842, watching frost patterns form on his small window. Outside, the world was white and hostile. Snow had been falling for 2 days straight, adding another foot to the 3 feet already on the ground. The wind howled across the valley with a sound like distant wolves, driving the temperature down past anything the crude thermometer outside his barn could measure. Inside his cabin, Lars wore a single wool shirt and felt comfortable. The fire in his small stone hearth was modest, barely a quarter of the wood consumption his neighbors were burning through to stay alive. Yet his interior temperature remained steady, hovering just above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to work, warm enough to sleep without heavy blankets, warm enough to survive indefinitely. The secret wasn't visible from outside. To anyone riding past Lars's homestead, and nobody was riding anywhere in weather like this, the property looked strange but not obviously innovative. There was a large barn, bigger than most settlers built, constructed from heavy timbers with unusual care. The barn had massive double doors facing south, currently closed against the wind and snow. Smoke rose from a chimney, but the chimney emerged from inside the barn rather than from a separate structure. Most people who had seen the property during construction assumed Lars was living temporarily in his barn while he prepared to build a proper cabin. That assumption was partly correct and entirely wrong. Lars had built a cabin. It was inside the barn. The cabin was small, efficient, and positioned with 8 to 10 feet of clear space on all sides between its walls and the interior walls of the barn that surrounded it. That empty space, that gap, filled with nothing but air, was saving his life. While his neighbors burned through their winter wood supplies, fighting losing battles against cold that seeped through every crack and gap in their log walls, Lars sat in comfortable warmth, protected by the simplest and most overlooked insulator known to man. Still air, trapped, unmoving, dead air that held heat like a blanket made of nothing. His neighbors had mocked him when he built it. They had called it wasteful, ridiculous, the work of a man who didn't understand frontier efficiency. By January of 1842, some of them were starting to wonder if maybe Lars understood something they didn't. The obsession that drove Lars to build his impossible structure began 1 year earlier, in the winter of 1841. That winter hadn't been as severe as the one that followed, but it had been cold enough to kill, and it had killed someone Lars cared about. His hunting partner, Thomas Reinhardt, a German immigrant who had come west 3 years before Lars, froze to death inside his own cabin during a 3-day blizzard in late February. The tragedy wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow, methodical, and entirely preventable, which made it worse. Thomas had run out of firewood on the 2nd day of the storm. His cabin, built using standard frontier construction methods, couldn't hold heat without a constant fire. The temperature inside dropped steadily as the storm raged outside. By the third day, when the wind finally stopped and Lars could make his way through the snow to check on his friend, Thomas was dead, curled under every blanket he owned, frozen solid in his own bed. Lars had helped build that cabin. He had used the same techniques every settler used, the same methods passed down from previous generations of frontiersmen: notched logs, mud and moss chinking, a stone fireplace, heavy door, small window. It was solid construction by any standard measure. It should have been enough, but it wasn't. Thomas had simply run out of fuel to feed the fire, and without that constant flame, the cabin became a wooden box that did almost nothing to protect its occupant from the killing cold outside. Lars buried Thomas when the ground thawed in April. He marked the grave with stones and spent the summer thinking about what had happened. Not just thinking, obsessing. Most men would have accepted the tragedy as part of frontier life, an unfortunate but not unusual death, the kind of risk everyone took when they chose to live in the mountains. Lars couldn't let it go. He kept returning to a simple question. Why did frontier cabins require constant fire to stay warm? The answer seemed obvious at first, because it was cold outside and warm inside, and heat naturally moved from warm to cold until everything reached the same temperature. But that answer wasn't complete. Heat moved, yes, but how did it move? Through what paths? At what rate? Could those paths be blocked or slowed? Lars wasn't an educated man. He had come to America from Norway at age 16, worked various jobs for 8 years, and moved west to trap and hunt when he was 24. He had basic literacy, practical skills with tools and construction, and a Norwegian upbringing that had exposed him to building methods adapted for extreme cold. But he had no formal training in physics or engineering. What he did have was a dead friend, a guilty conscience, and an entire summer to think about how to build shelter that worked differently than what everyone else was building. Lars spent the summer and fall of 1841 studying cabins, not building them, studying them. He visited other homesteads in the valley, looked at abandoned structures, and paid careful attention to his own small cabin where he had lived for 2 years. He was looking for patterns in how cabins failed to hold heat. The first and most obvious problem was chinking. Every settler packed the gaps between logs with some mixture of mud, moss, clay, and whatever else was available. The chinking worked for a few months, sometimes a full season. Then it dried, cracked, and fell out. Wind blew through the gaps. Cold air poured in. Warm air escaped. Rechinking was constant maintenance, and even fresh chinking wasn't airtight. Lars calculated roughly that the gaps in a typical cabin's chinking represented several square feet of open holes to the outside, equivalent to leaving a window open all winter. The second problem was the logs themselves. Wood was a decent insulator compared to stone or metal, but a log wall was still only 8 to 12 inches thick. In extreme cold, that wasn't enough. Heat moved through the wood from inside to outside through simple conduction. You could feel it if you placed your hand on an interior wall during bitter cold. The wood was cold to the touch because heat was flowing through it constantly, escaping to the frigid air outside. Thicker logs would help, but only marginally. A 16-inch log wall would be better than a 12-inch wall, but not twice as good. And cutting, moving, and fitting logs that thick would be nearly impossible for one man working alone. The third problem was radiant heat loss. This one took Lars longer to understand because it was less visible than gaps in chinking or thin walls. But he noticed that even on calm, windless nights when his chinking was fresh and gaps were minimal, his cabin still lost heat at a rate that required constant fire feeding. He realized that heat was radiating away from the warm cabin walls into the cold night air, just like how you could feel warmth radiating from a fire even without touching it. The cabin walls were warm, the outside air was cold, and heat radiated from the warm surface until it dissipated into the vastness of the frozen atmosphere. No amount of chinking or thicker logs would stop radiant heat loss. It was fundamental physics. Lars spent weeks thinking about these three problems: infiltration, through gaps, conduction through walls, and radiation from surfaces. Every cabin in the territory suffered from all three simultaneously. The only solution anyone knew was to burn more wood, maintain hotter fires, and accept that winter meant constant fuel consumption and constant fire tending. If you ran out of wood or couldn't maintain your fire, you died. Thomas had proven that, but Lars kept thinking there had to be a different approach. The idea came to Lars in late November of 1841, and it came from an unexpected source. He had built a small barn the previous summer to shelter his 2 horses and store hay. The barn was simple, just 4 walls and a roof, with gaps between the wallboards for ventilation. It wasn't meant to be warm, just to provide wind protection and keep hay dry. But Lars noticed something odd during the first cold snap of winter. When he went into the barn in the morning to feed the horses, the interior was noticeably warmer than the outside air. Not warm by any human comfort standard, but measurably warmer. Maybe 10 degrees difference. The barn had gaps in its walls. It had no fire. The horses produced some body heat, but not much. Yet somehow the barn interior was warmer than the world outside. Lars spent several days thinking about why. The barn blocked wind, which helped. But his cabin also blocked wind, and it still required constant fire. The barn had a large volume of air inside it. That air couldn't circulate freely to the outside because, despite the ventilation gaps, most of the barn's envelope was solid boards. The air inside was trapped, mostly still, and that still air was acting as an insulator. The horses' minimal body heat, combined with slight solar heating during the day, warmed that trapped air a few degrees. The warmed air stayed trapped because it couldn't easily escape. The process was passive, requiring no fire or effort, just trapped air doing what trapped air does naturally, insulating whatever is inside it from whatever is outside. Lars had a sudden thought that seemed crazy even to him. What if he built a cabin inside a barn? Not just temporarily while constructing a proper cabin, but permanently. A small, tight, well-built cabin positioned in the center of a larger barn structure. The barn would trap a huge volume of air around the cabin. That air would be warmer than the outside air because it was trapped and sheltered. The cabin sitting in that warmer air would lose less heat. It would need less fire. Maybe significantly less fire. Maybe little enough fire that running out of wood wouldn't be a death sentence. The idea violated everything Lars knew about frontier construction efficiency. You built structures as small as possible to minimize material and labor. Building 2 structures, one inside the other, was wasteful by definition. The labor would be enormous. The wood consumption would be double. But Lars couldn't stop thinking about Thomas frozen in his bed, killed by a construction method that everyone used because it was traditional and efficient. Maybe efficiency was the wrong goal. Maybe survival should be the goal, and if survival required building something that seemed wasteful, then waste was actually investment. Lars began planning in December of 1841, but he couldn't start building until spring. Winter construction in the Montana Territory was nearly impossible. The ground was frozen solid, making it difficult to set foundation elements. Snow made timber harvesting dangerous and exhausting. The cold itself made physical labor brutal and tools brittle. So Lars spent the winter months doing something more valuable than building. He planned every detail of what he would construct when the snow melted. He sketched rough diagrams on pieces of bark using charcoal from his fire. He calculated dimensions, estimated timber quantities, and thought through construction sequences. By the time the first thaw came in late March of 1842, Lars had a complete mental blueprint of his impossible structure. The first task was selecting the building site. Lars owned 160 acres of valley land with creek access and timber coverage. His current cabin sat near the creek for water convenience, the same location most settlers chose. But Lars planned to build his new structure on higher ground, about 50 yards from the creek on a slight rise that provided drainage and sight lines. The location meant hauling water uphill daily, but it also meant his structure would never flood during spring runoff, and he would be able to see anyone or anything approaching from a distance. Security and dry foundation were worth the inconvenience of water hauling. The second task was timber harvesting, and this was where the scale of Lars's ambition became visible. A standard frontier cabin required 40 to 50 logs depending on size. Lars needed logs for a barn 30 feet by 40 feet, plus logs for a cabin 16 feet by 20 feet inside the barn. He estimated he needed at least 120 suitable logs, plus additional timber for roof framing, door construction, and interior elements. That represented hundreds of hours of felling, limbing, hauling, and preparing. Most men worked in pairs for cabin construction, sharing the immense labor. Lars would be working alone. He accepted that the project would consume his entire summer and likely extend into fall. Lars began felling trees in early April. He selected standing dead pine and spruce when possible. Dead trees were seasoned, lighter to move, and less likely to warp as they dried. He avoided green timber except when necessary for specific structural elements that needed flexibility. Each tree was evaluated before cutting. Lars wanted logs between 10 and 14 inches in diameter, as straight as possible, with minimal taper from base to top. He rejected trees with excessive knots, rot, or twist. This selectivity meant he had to range across his entire property and even onto adjacent unclaimed land to find suitable timber. He spent weeks just marking trees before he cut a single one. The actual felling was dangerous, solitary work. Lars used a sharp axe and a two-man crosscut saw that he operated alone, pulling and pushing the saw through trunks that were sometimes 3 feet in diameter. Each tree took hours to drop, limb, and section into appropriate lengths. Then came the brutal work of hauling. Lars used his 2 horses hitched to chains, dragging logs from the forest to his building site. The horses could move logs that no man could carry, but the process was slow, careful, and exhausting for both man and animals. By late May of 1842, Lars had assembled enough timber at his building site to begin construction. His neighbors, the few who lived within visiting distance, started noticing the scale of what he was accumulating. A trapper named Joseph Miller rode by in early June and stopped to talk. He looked at the massive pile of logs, looked at the foundation stakes Lars had set in the ground outlining a 30-foot by 40-foot structure, and asked the obvious question. What was Lars building that required a barn bigger than most settlers' cabins? Lars explained patiently that he was building a barn first, and then he would build his cabin inside it. Joseph stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. He thought Lars was joking. When he realized Lars was serious, the laughter stopped, replaced by confused concern. Why would anyone build a cabin inside a barn? Lars tried to explain the insulation principle, the trapped air concept, the heat retention theory. Joseph listened politely and then suggested carefully that Lars might want to reconsider before he wasted all that timber and labor on something that made no sense. Lars didn't reconsider. He began building the barn using techniques he had learned in Norway and adapted for local materials. The foundation was rock-lined trenches filled with gravel for drainage. The corner posts were the largest logs he had harvested, sunk 3 feet into the ground and extending 12 feet above grade. These posts would carry the roof load and provide structural stability. Between the corner posts, Lars constructed walls from horizontal logs, notched and fitted with care. He didn't strip the bark on these outer logs. Bark provided minor additional insulation and weather protection, and since this was a barn, not a finished cabin, aesthetic concerns were minimal. What mattered was creating a solid envelope that would block wind and trap air. The barn walls went up through June and into July. Lars worked alone, using a ramp system to lift heavy logs into place as the walls grew higher. The process was slow and physically demanding. Each log had to be measured, notched, lifted, positioned, and secured. Lars used wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes to pin logs together at intervals, adding structural rigidity beyond what the notches provided. By mid-July, the barn walls were complete, standing 12 feet high at the eaves with a peaked roof frame rising another 6 feet to the ridge. The structure was massive by frontier standards. It dominated the building site, visible from a mile away. The roof construction took another 3 weeks. Lars built a sturdy frame using ridge poles and rafters, then covered it with split planks. Over the planks, he laid overlapping sections of bark for waterproofing, and over the bark, he spread a layer of sod. The roof was heavy, but the robust wall structure supported it easily. By early August, the barn was complete and weatherproof. Lars had built massive double doors on the south side, hung on iron hinges he had purchased in town the previous year. The doors could swing wide enough to drive a wagon through, though Lars had no wagon. With the barn complete, Lars turned his attention to the structure that would actually keep him alive. Inside the cavernous barn interior, he laid out the dimensions of his cabin. 16 feet by 20 feet, positioned carefully so that 8 to 10 feet of clear space existed between every cabin wall and the nearest barn wall. The positioning wasn't random. Lars wanted maximum air gap volume around the cabin, but he also wanted the cabin centered to prevent any direct thermal bridging where the cabin might touch or come too close to the barn walls. The air gap had to be complete, uninterrupted, and substantial. That trapped air was the entire point of this elaborate construction. Lars began the cabin foundation in mid-August. Unlike the barn, which sat on rock-lined trenches, the cabin required something more substantial. He dug a shallow perimeter and filled it with carefully fitted stones, creating a level base that lifted the cabin floor 8 inches above the barn's dirt floor. This elevation provided underfloor air circulation and prevented ground moisture from wicking into the cabin logs. The foundation work took a week, but it was critical. This cabin had to last decades, not just seasons. The cabin logs were different from the barn timber. Lars had reserved his best logs for this inner structure. Each one was straight, uniform in diameter, and carefully stripped of all bark. He used his draw knife to smooth the contact surfaces where logs would stack against each other, creating tight fits that minimized gaps. The corners used dovetail notches, more time-consuming than simple saddle notches, but creating stronger, tighter joints. Lars worked with obsessive precision. Every log was tested for fit before final placement. Any gap larger than 1/4 inch was unacceptable and required additional shaping. The cabin walls rose slowly through late August and into September. Unlike the barn, which had been visible to anyone passing by, the cabin construction was hidden inside the barn structure. Lars worked in the sheltered interior, protected from rain and wind. The barn became his workshop, and the isolation was welcome. He didn't want visitors questioning his methods or offering advice based on conventional wisdom. He was building something unconventional, and he needed to focus without distraction. Between each cabin log, Lars packed a chinking mixture he had developed through experimentation. Clay formed the base, mixed with dried grass for binding and pine pitch for waterproofing. The mixture was labor-intensive to prepare, but created a seal far superior to standard mud and moss chinking. Lars applied it carefully, packing every gap completely. He knew this cabin would need to be as airtight as possible. Any air leaking directly from cabin interior to barn interior would reduce the efficiency of his thermal buffer system. By late September, the cabin walls stood complete. Lars built a stone fireplace in the northwest corner, using river stones carefully selected for their flat surfaces and heat resistance. The chimney extended up through the cabin roof and then through the barn roof above, requiring careful flashing to prevent leaks. The fireplace was small, designed for efficiency rather than heating a large space. The space between the cabin walls and the barn walls was the heart of Lars's innovation, but it wasn't simply empty volume. Lars had thought carefully about how that space needed to function. The air trapped in that gap would act as insulation only if it remained relatively still. Moving air, circulating air, carried heat away through convection. Still air held heat in place. Lars needed to create conditions where the air in the gap would stratify naturally, with warmer air rising and cooler air sinking, but without creating strong circulation currents that would pump heat out of the system. The distance he had chosen, 8 to 10 feet, was based on observations from his barn experiments the previous winter and childhood memories of Norwegian construction techniques. In Norway, some of the older farmhouses in the coldest regions used double-wall construction on a smaller scale, an exterior wall and an interior wall with a gap between them, usually 2 to 3 feet. The gap was sometimes filled with sawdust or left empty as an air space. Lars had seen these buildings as a boy and remembered that they stayed warmer than single-wall structures. He was applying the same principle but scaling it up dramatically. Instead of a 2-foot gap, he had 8 to 10 feet. Instead of filling it with sawdust, he was using pure air. The volume of air in his barn around the cabin was enormous, roughly calculated at over 5,000 cubic feet. That mass of air would take hours to cool once warmed, and it would warm passively from solar heating of the barn during the day and from heat escaping the cabin. Lars also designed specific features to control how the air gap functioned. Near the peak of the barn roof, he had built small ventilation shutters that could be opened or closed from inside the barn. These shutters served a counterintuitive purpose. In extreme cold, they would be closed, trapping all air inside. But in moderate weather or during the day when sun warmed the barn excessively, Lars could open them slightly to release the hottest air and prevent the barn interior from becoming uncomfortably warm. This gave him control over the thermal environment. Most frontier structures had no temperature control beyond fire size. Lars was building a system that could be tuned and adjusted. The cabin itself had no direct openings to the barn interior except the door. No windows on the barn-facing walls, no ventilation holes, nothing that would allow cabin air to mix with barn air. The cabin was a sealed box within a larger sealed box. Heat escaping the cabin would warm the barn interior air. That warmed air would reduce the temperature differential between cabin walls and surrounding air, which would slow heat loss from the cabin. The slower heat loss meant less fire needed, which meant less wood consumption, which meant longer survival if wood supplies ran low. The physics were simple once Lars understood them, but implementing them required construction precision that went far beyond typical frontier building standards. The entry system Lars designed was as critical as the air gap itself. A door was fundamentally a hole in the structure's thermal envelope, and every time that hole opened, cold air rushed in and warm air rushed out. Standard cabins had single doors that opened directly from outside to interior. Every entry during winter meant a blast of freezing air invading the living space, dropping interior temperature, and requiring more fire to compensate. Lars needed to eliminate that direct connection between outside cold and inside warmth. His solution was an airlock system, though he didn't use that term. He simply understood that if he put two doors in series with space between them, he could minimize cold air infiltration. The barn's massive double doors faced south to maximize solar gain during winter. They were hung on heavy iron hinges and could be secured from inside with a thick wooden beam that dropped into iron brackets. These doors were the first barrier against the outside world. They were solid, well-fitted, and designed to block wind and snow. But they weren't airtight, and they didn't need to be. Their job was to create a sheltered zone just inside the barn where temperature would be warmer than outside, but colder than the barn interior. This entry zone was about 6 feet deep, the space between the barn doors and the beginning of the air gap around the cabin. The cabin's door was positioned on the south wall, facing the barn doors, but with the full 8-foot air gap between cabin wall and barn wall. So the path from outside to cabin interior required 3 steps. First, open the barn doors and step into the entry zone. Second, close the barn doors behind you. Third, walk across the barn floor and open the cabin door. The key was that the barn doors would be closed before the cabin door opened. Cold outside air would enter the barn's entry zone when the barn doors opened, but that air wouldn't reach the main barn interior or the cabin if the doors were closed promptly. Then, walking across the barn floor from barn doors to cabin door, you moved through the warmer barn interior air. By the time you reached the cabin door, you had shed the worst of the outside cold. Lars built the cabin door with the same care he had used for the barn doors. Heavy planks, reinforced with diagonal bracing, hung on iron hinges. The door was thick, tight-fitting, and equipped with a sturdy locking bar on the interior. Weather stripping around the frame was made from leather strips Lars had cut and tanned himself, creating a seal that blocked drafts when the door was closed. The cabin door was the final barrier, the last defense against cold. It had to be as close to airtight as frontier construction methods allowed. The system worked exactly as Lars had envisioned. To enter his cabin from outside in winter, he would open the barn doors, step inside, close the barn doors, cross the barn floor, open the cabin door, step into the cabin, and close the cabin door. The process took perhaps 30 seconds longer than entering a standard cabin, but it prevented almost all cold air from reaching his living space. As Lars completed the cabin interior, he added a feature that most observers wouldn't understand even if they saw it. Along the interior walls of his cabin, particularly on the north and west sides where cold was most severe, he built stone backing, not decorative stonework, but functional thermal mass. He gathered river stones, hundreds of them, and stacked them against the interior cabin walls from floor to about 4 feet high. The stones weren't mortared, just carefully stacked and fitted. Then he built a secondary interior wall of thin planks about 4 inches in front of the stone stacks, creating a gap between the stones and the cabin's living space. The result looked like simple interior finishing, but it served a sophisticated thermal purpose. The stones absorbed heat during the day when the fire was burning and the cabin was warm. Stone's thermal mass was enormous compared to wood. A cubic foot of stone could store roughly 4 times as much heat as a cubic foot of wood. As the stones warmed throughout the day, they became heat batteries, storing energy. Then, at night, when the fire was banked low or allowed to burn down, the stones slowly released their stored heat back into the cabin interior. The heat radiated through the plank wall, warming the living space for hours after the fire had diminished. This thermal flywheel effect meant Lars could let his fire burn lower at night without the cabin temperature dropping precipitously. The stones would carry him through the coldest hours before dawn. But the thermal mass served a second purpose that was even more important to Lars's overall design. The stones against the cabin's exterior walls were positioned to face the barn interior. Heat that would normally conduct directly through the cabin logs to the colder barn interior air was instead absorbed by the stones first. The stones warmed slowly, taking hours to reach equilibrium temperature. During that time, they were intercepting heat that would otherwise escape. Then, when the stones did warm and begin radiating heat, some of that radiation went into the barn interior, warming the air gap, but some reflected back into the cabin interior, reclaiming energy that would have been lost. Lars had learned about thermal mass from Norwegian building traditions. In Norway's coldest regions, masonry stoves called kakaloven were built with enormous stone or brick mass. A fire burned in the stove for a few hours, heating the masonry to extreme temperatures. Then the fire was extinguished and the masonry radiated heat for 12 to 18 hours, keeping homes warm overnight with no active fire. Lars couldn't build a full masonry stove, but he could apply the principle. His stone-backed walls were a simplified version of the same concept, adapted to frontier materials and his specific thermal design. The installation took 2 weeks, hauling stones from the creek bed and stacking them carefully. The work was hard, and the stones added significant weight to the cabin structure, but Lars had built the foundation to handle it. When he finally completed the interior walls over the stone backing, the cabin looked finished and conventional from inside. By late September of 1842, Lars's structure was complete. The barn stood massive and weatherproof, the cabin nested inside tight and carefully crafted. Lars moved his possessions from his old cabin into the new one, a process that took only a single afternoon. He didn't own much: a bedroll, cooking equipment, tools, trapping gear, a few books, clothing, and supplies. Everything fit easily into the small interior space he had created. The cabin felt almost cramped compared to the old structure he had lived in, but Lars wasn't concerned about interior space. He was concerned about staying alive through winter, and smaller spaces were easier to heat. His neighbors noticed the move, and several stopped by to see the completed project. Their reactions ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. Joseph Miller, the trapper who had questioned Lars's sanity in June, returned in early October and walked through the structure with obvious skepticism. He examined the barn, looked at the tiny cabin inside, and couldn't understand the point. Lars tried explaining again. The barn keeps the air around the cabin warmer. The cabin loses less heat because it sits in warmer air. Less heat loss means less firewood needed. Joseph listened, but clearly didn't believe it would work. He pointed out that Lars had spent an entire summer building what amounted to 2 structures when he only needed one. The labor was wasted. The materials were wasted. And for what? So he could live in a small cabin inside a big barn when he could have just built a bigger cabin with all that timber. Other visitors were less polite. A settler named William Horace, who had a homestead 5 miles east, called it the stupidest thing he had ever seen. He joked that Lars had built himself a jail inside a warehouse. Another neighbor suggested Lars was preparing to raise livestock in the barn around his cabin, and when Lars explained that wasn't the plan, the neighbor asked why else anyone would waste space and materials like that. Lars stopped trying to explain. He simply thanked people for visiting and went back to his preparations. He didn't need them to understand. He needed the design to work. Through October and into November, Lars stocked firewood. This was the critical test. If his thermal design worked, he would need significantly less wood than a standard cabin required. But if it failed, if he had miscalculated or misunderstood the physics, he would be trapped in an elaborate structure that didn't function any better than a simple cabin. He cut and stacked what he estimated was half the wood he had burned the previous winter. Other settlers stocked enough wood to last 4 months of hard cold. Lars stocked enough for 2 months if his calculations were right. If they were wrong, he would run out of fuel by late January. The weather stayed mild through most of November, postponing the real test. Lars used the time to fine-tune details. He adjusted the leather weather stripping on doors. He checked chinking for any gaps he had missed. He tested his ventilation shutters, making sure they opened and closed smoothly. He arranged his interior efficiently, storing supplies and organizing his space. Everything was ready. Now he just needed winter to arrive. The first serious cold came on December 3rd, 1842. Lars woke to find the temperature had dropped overnight to somewhere near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow had begun falling before dawn, and by mid-morning, several inches covered the ground. This wasn't the brutal deep cold that would come later, but it was cold enough to test his system. Lars built a small fire in his fireplace, using perhaps a third of the wood he would have burned in his old cabin on a morning like this. Then he waited to see what would happen. By noon, he had his first measurements. Lars had constructed crude thermometers using glass tubes partially filled with colored alcohol, sealed and marked with gradations. The principle was simple. Alcohol expanded when warm and contracted when cold. The level in the tube indicated temperature. He had one thermometer hanging outside the barn, one in the barn interior near the cabin wall, and one inside the cabin. The outside thermometer read approximately 12 degrees. The barn interior thermometer read 28 degrees. The cabin interior thermometer read 46 degrees. Lars studied the numbers carefully. The 16-degree difference between outside and barn interior was promising. The 18-degree difference between barn interior and cabin interior was even better. His cabin was 34 degrees warmer than the outside air with only a modest fire burning. Over the next week, as the cold settled in and temperatures dropped further, Lars monitored constantly. He kept notes on bark pieces, recording outside temperature, barn temperature, cabin temperature, fire size, and wood consumption. Patterns emerged quickly. The barn interior stayed consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside, even with no direct heat source. The thermal mass from the barn structure itself, combined with minor solar heating during the day, kept the trapped air measurably warmer. The cabin interior maintained comfortable temperatures, generally between 45 and 55 degrees, with fires that consumed roughly half the wood Lars had burned in his previous cabin. The system was working, but Lars also discovered its quirks. The barn interior temperature responded to outside temperature changes with a lag of several hours. When outside temperature dropped suddenly, the barn interior took 3 to 4 hours to follow. This thermal inertia was beneficial. It meant the cabin wasn't exposed to rapid temperature swings. When a cold front moved through, the cabin environment remained relatively stable while the barn's thermal mass buffered the change. Lars also noticed that on sunny winter days, even when outside air was bitterly cold, the barn interior warmed significantly. Solar radiation heated the barn's dark wood surfaces, which warmed the air inside. This passive solar gain was unintentional but welcome. Some days, the barn interior reached 40 degrees just from sun exposure, and those were days Lars barely needed fire at all. The double-door system proved essential. Lars experimented with different entry procedures and found that closing the barn doors before opening the cabin door was critical. Deep winter arrived in early January of 1843. This was the cold that killed, the sustained bitter temperatures that tested everything. On January 9th, the outside thermometer read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars had never seen it that cold. The air itself seemed different at that temperature, thicker somehow, resistant to breathing. Frost formed instantly on any exposed skin. Metal tools left outside became dangerous to touch with bare hands. This was the cold that had killed Thomas 2 years earlier. This was the cold Lars had built his structure to survive. Inside the barn, protected from wind and wrapped in his thermal envelope, Lars checked his thermometers. Outside, minus 38. Barn interior, plus 10 degrees. Cabin interior, 52 degrees. He did the arithmetic carefully, checking it twice. The difference between outside air and cabin interior was exactly 90 degrees. But more importantly, his cabin was maintaining a livable temperature, 52 degrees, with a fire so small he could have covered it with a cooking pot. He was burning perhaps 1/6 the wood that a standard cabin would require in these conditions. The validation was complete and undeniable. Lars sat at his small table and calculated his wood consumption rate. At his current burning rate, his wood supply would last well into March, possibly into April if the cold broke early. In a standard cabin, he would have run out of wood by mid-February. The difference between those two dates was the difference between life and death. If he had been caught in his old cabin with his current wood supply when this cold arrived, he would be in Thomas's situation, rationing wood, watching his supply dwindle, knowing he wouldn't make it to spring. But in his barn-wrapped cabin, he was comfortable, warm, and secure. The thermal mass stones were performing exactly as intended. During the day, when Lars maintained a moderate fire for cooking and comfort, the stones absorbed heat steadily. By evening, they were warm to the touch through the plank wall. At night, Lars let the fire burn down to coals. The cabin temperature would drop slowly, buffered by heat radiating from the stones. By morning, the cabin might be down to 42 degrees, cool but not dangerous. He would rebuild the fire, and within an hour, the space was comfortable again. The cycle repeated daily, and Lars never felt the desperate cold that penetrated standard cabins. The barn interior itself became a fascinating environment. Lars spent time outside the cabin but inside the barn, observing how the space functioned. Even at plus 10 degrees, the barn interior felt dramatically different from the minus 38-degree world outside. There was no wind. The air was still, almost peaceful. Frost patterns formed on the interior barn walls, creating intricate crystalline designs. The cabin, sitting in the center of this protected space, radiated gentle warmth that Lars could feel when standing near its walls. The entire system functioned as an integrated thermal machine, each element contributing to the overall performance. The blizzard hit on January 14, 1843, and it lasted 5 days. Wind drove snow horizontally across the valley, piling drifts 15 feet high against anything that blocked its path. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature never rose above minus 20 degrees, and at night it plunged past minus 30. This was survival weather, the kind that killed people caught unprepared or trapped in inadequate shelter. Lars stayed inside his cabin for the entire duration, venturing only into the barn interior twice daily to check on his horses. He burned wood steadily but not desperately, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures while the storm raged outside. 3 miles east, William Horace nearly froze in his cabin. His structure was standard. Frontier construction, well built by normal measures, but not designed for sustained extreme cold. When the blizzard hit, William began burning wood at a furious rate, trying to keep his interior temperature above freezing. By the 3rd day, he realized he was going through his supply too fast. He started rationing, letting the fire burn lower, accepting colder interior temperatures to conserve fuel. By the 5th day, when the storm finally broke, William had burned through 7 days' worth of wood in 5 days. His interior temperature had dropped to 28 degrees despite constant fire, and he was genuinely afraid he wouldn't survive another storm like that. Joseph Miller, living 4 miles northwest of Lars, had a similar experience. His cabin was slightly better insulated than William's, but the sustained cold overwhelmed his structure's capacity to retain heat. Joseph burned a week's worth of wood in those 5 days. His hands developed minor frostbite from having to go outside repeatedly to bring in more firewood from his outdoor stack. When the storm ended, he was exhausted, cold, and shaken by how close he had come to a dangerous situation. 2 other settlers in the valley, men Lars knew only by name, survived but used up nearly all their remaining wood supplies fighting the blizzard. One of them, realizing he wouldn't make it through the rest of winter with what he had left, packed up and left for the nearest town as soon as the weather cleared. He abandoned his homestead rather than risk freezing. Lars emerged from the storm having burned perhaps 40% of what his neighbors had consumed. His interior temperature had never dropped below 48 degrees. He had felt comfortable enough to read by firelight in the evenings, something his neighbors couldn't have considered while desperately feeding fires just to stay alive. When Joseph Miller rode over to check on Lars 3 days after the storm ended, he found Lars splitting wood outside the barn, working at a relaxed pace, looking well-rested and healthy. Joseph, by contrast, was exhausted and rattled. He asked Lars directly how much wood he had burned during the 5-day storm. Lars told him. Joseph didn't believe it at first. Joseph asked to see inside the structure. Lars opened the barn doors and showed him the cabin sitting in its protective air gap. He explained again how the system worked, but this time Joseph was listening differently. He wasn't hearing theory anymore. He was hearing an explanation for why Lars looked comfortable and rested, while Joseph felt like he had barely survived. Word spread through the scattered settlement community slowly but inevitably. By late January, most of the homesteaders within 10 miles knew that Lars had survived the blizzard using half the wood consumption of standard cabins. Some remained skeptical, assuming Lars was exaggerating or that some other factor explained his success. But others, particularly those who had nearly run out of fuel during the storm, started asking serious questions. In early February, William Horace rode to Lars's homestead specifically to understand what Lars had built and how it worked. Lars walked William through the entire structure. He showed him the barn construction, explained the air gap dimensions, demonstrated the double door system, and described the thermal mass stones inside the cabin. William asked practical questions. How long did construction take? Where did Lars get the iron hardware? What did the complete project cost in materials and labor? Lars answered everything honestly. Yes, it took an entire summer. Yes, it required twice the timber of a standard cabin. Yes, the labor was enormous. But the result was a structure that would keep him alive through winters that killed men in normal cabins. William left thoughtful but uncommitted. The investment seemed too large, the concept too unconventional. But 3 weeks later, in late February, another cold snap hit, not as severe as the January blizzard, but cold enough to be dangerous. William burned through another week's worth of wood in 4 days. He realized his remaining supply wouldn't last until spring. He would have to choose between abandoning his homestead or risking death if another major storm arrived. He rode back to Lars's place in early March and asked if Lars would help him build a barn-wrapped cabin before the next winter. Lars agreed. He wasn't trying to profit from his innovation or establish some kind of frontier construction business. He was simply willing to share knowledge that could save lives. Over the spring and summer of 1843, Lars spent several weeks helping William construct a barn-wrapped cabin on William's property. The design was slightly different, adapted to William's specific site and available materials, but the core principles remained identical. Large barn, small cabin inside, substantial air gap, double-door entry system, thermal mass elements. William provided the labor and materials. Lars provided the knowledge and helped with the technical aspects of construction. By fall of 1843, William's barn-wrapped cabin was complete. He moved in before the first snow. Joseph Miller, watching William's construction progress throughout the summer, decided he wanted the same protection. He began building his own version in August, working alone as Lars had done, using Lars's design principles. Joseph's structure was finished by late October. 2 other settlers who had heard about the concept started planning their own barn-wrapped cabins for construction the following spring. The spread wasn't rapid or dramatic. Most settlers still built conventional cabins, either because they hadn't heard about Lars's innovation or because they considered the investment too large. But among those who had experienced genuinely dangerous cold, who had felt the terror of watching their wood supplies dwindle while winter continued, the appeal was obvious. Over the next 5 years, from 1843 through 1848, barn-wrapped cabins appeared across northern Montana Territory and into what would eventually become southern Alberta, Canada. The technique spread through word of mouth among trappers, homesteaders, and frontier settlers. Lars never promoted his innovation through any formal means. He simply built something that worked, and people who needed similar protection adopted his methods. The name barn cabin or double-wall homestead became common terminology for the design. Some settlers called them Norwegian style, because Lars was Norwegian and because similar double-wall principles existed in Scandinavian construction traditions. The design variations were considerable. Some builders created smaller air gaps, 5 to 6 feet instead of 8 to 10 to reduce lumber requirements. Others built larger structures, housing livestock in the barn space around the cabin to add animal body heat to the thermal system. A few settlers experimented with filling the air gap partially with hay or sawdust, creating hybrid designs that combined air insulation with solid insulation. These variations had different performance characteristics, but all shared the core insight that Lars had discovered. Trapped air between two structural envelopes dramatically reduced heat loss and wood consumption. Norwegian settlers, particularly those who had immigrated from the coldest regions of Norway, embraced the barn cabin concept most enthusiastically. They recognized the principles from their homeland building traditions and understood the physics intuitively. Several Norwegian families settling in northern territories built barn cabins as their first structures, rather than starting with conventional cabins and upgrading later. German settlers from cold climate regions also adopted the technique readily. British and American settlers were generally more skeptical, but practical results convinced some to build barn cabins despite their unfamiliarity with the concept. By 1848, an estimated 20 to 30 barn-wrapped cabins existed across the northern frontier, scattered across hundreds of miles of territory. The exact number was impossible to determine because settlers built homesteads in remote locations and didn't report their construction methods to any central authority. But trappers and traders traveling through the region encountered barn cabins with increasing frequency, and the reputation of the design spread through frontier communication networks. Stories circulated about settlers surviving brutal winters using half the firewood of their neighbors, about families staying comfortable in temperatures that would have been deadly in standard cabins. The technique also influenced conventional cabin construction in subtle ways. Settlers who couldn't or wouldn't invest in full barn cabin construction began adopting elements of Lars's design: thicker, chinking materials inspired by Lars's clay mixture, better weather stripping on doors, interior thermal mass elements, like stone, backing on walls. Double-door entry systems, where an outer storm door created a small airlock space. These incremental improvements didn't provide the dramatic performance gains of complete barn cabin construction, but they helped, and they saved wood and lives on the margins. Lars Eriksson lived in his barn-wrapped cabin for 25 years. He married in 1847 a widow named Ingrid Halvorsen, who had lost her husband to pneumonia the previous winter. Ingrid had 2 young children from her first marriage, and Lars became a father to them. The family lived in the cabin that had been designed for one solitary trapper, and while the space was tight, the warmth and security were undeniable. Ingrid, who had spent winters in a standard cabin shivering under blankets while her first husband burned through wood supplies desperately, immediately appreciated what Lars had built. She understood the innovation not as theory, but as lived experience, the difference between constant cold and genuine comfort. Lars and Ingrid had 3 more children together over the following decade. As the family grew, Lars expanded the cabin modestly, adding a small loft space and widening one wall by 4 feet. The modifications were done carefully, maintaining the air gap and thermal principles. The barn provided ample space for children to play during brutal winter weather when going outside was impossible. The protected interior became a workspace, storage area, and safe zone, where children could move freely without exposure to deadly cold. Lars continued trapping through the 1850s, though beaver populations had declined and markets had shifted. He supplemented trapping income with occasional carpentry work, helping other settlers build structures. He never charged specifically for sharing his barn cabin knowledge, but settlers who wanted his expertise naturally hired him for the construction work, and he was paid fairly for his labor. Over the years, Lars helped build or advise on perhaps a dozen barn cabins across the territory, each one slightly different, but all based on his core principles. In 1867, at age 58, Lars died from injuries sustained when a horse kicked him while he was shoeing it in the barn. The death was sudden and unexpected. He was buried on his property on a hillside overlooking the valley where he had lived for 3 decades. Ingrid and the children continued living in the barn cabin for another 8 years before eventually moving to a larger town where the younger children could attend school. They sold the property to a young couple newly arrived from Minnesota. The structure stood for decades beyond Lars's lifetime. The new owners maintained it well, understanding its value. By the 1880s, when the property changed hands again, the barn showed wear, but remained structurally sound. The cabin interior was still tight and functional. In the 1900s, as settlement patterns changed and new construction methods arrived, the property was eventually abandoned. But even into the 1920s, travelers reported seeing the old barn still standing, weathered but intact, a testament to construction quality that far exceeded normal frontier standards. The cabin inside had finally collapsed from neglect, but the barn that had protected it for so many decades remained. The story of Lars Eriksson's barn-wrapped cabin teaches a principle that extends far beyond frontier construction. Innovation often comes not from fighting harder against a problem, but from understanding the problem differently and designing systems that make the fight unnecessary. Lars didn't defeat winter cold by burning more wood than his neighbors. He defeated it by building a structure that needed less wood because it lost less heat. The distinction is fundamental. One approach exhausts resources fighting an endless battle. The other approach changes the conditions of the battle itself. Frontier culture in the 1840s emphasized toughness, endurance, and direct confrontation with hardship. Real men survived through strength and will, burning through wood supplies, enduring cold, accepting risk as the price of freedom. Lars's innovation challenged that cultural narrative. He proposed that intelligence and careful engineering could provide better protection than toughness alone. The mockery he faced initially reflected cultural resistance to that idea. Building a cabin inside a barn looked weak, overcomplicated, the work of someone afraid to face winter directly. But Lars proved that engineering wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. The physics Lars utilized were straightforward once understood, but not obvious without careful observation. Air is an excellent insulator when trapped and still, but a terrible insulator when moving. Standard cabins had thin walls and multiple air leakage points. Every gap, crack, and poorly fitted joint allowed air movement that carried heat away through convection. Lars eliminated air movement by sealing his cabin tightly and surrounding it with a massive volume of still air protected by the barn envelope. The heat that escaped his cabin warmed the barn interior air, which reduced the temperature differential, driving further heat loss. The system was self-regulating. The more heat the cabin lost, the warmer the barn interior became, which slowed additional heat loss. The broader impact of Lars's innovation is difficult to quantify, but certainly significant. Lives were saved, though we cannot count them precisely. Wood consumption was reduced across dozens of homesteads over multiple decades, representing thousands of hours of labor saved from woodcutting and hauling. Families stayed together through winters that might otherwise have forced them to abandon homesteads. Children grew up in homes that were genuinely warm rather than barely survivable. These impacts rippled through frontier communities in ways that never appeared in historical records but shaped the survival and success of northern settlement. Modern construction has moved far beyond Lars's methods. Sophisticated insulation materials, advanced heating systems, and engineered building envelopes provide thermal performance Lars could never have imagined. But the principle he discovered remains relevant. The best solution to any survival challenge is often the one that eliminates the challenge rather than fighting it directly. Lars Eriksson built a cabin that bears couldn't break into would have been impressive. He built a cabin that winter couldn't freeze was revolutionary.